Welcome to What Works for Women at Work. I'm your host, Evelyn Akselrod, and this season I'm talking to bold and accomplished women who are ready to spill the secrets to their incredible success. Come join me and unlock the doors to your leadership breakthrough. Let's dive in. Right, well, hello everyone, and welcome back to What Works for Women at Work. Today we are with author, entrepreneur, and women's leadership expert Belinda Clemmensen. Welcome, Belinda.
Thanks, Evelyn. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Thank you. It is my honor very much so to sit down with you. Can you start us off by telling us a little bit more about you?
Sure. So I am a lifelong entrepreneur. I was thinking about this. I did work for somebody else for, I think, a year, less than a year, maybe. But other than that, my entire life, I've been an entrepreneur. And most of that has been in the leadership development space. I sort of found that early in my career, loved it, went deep into it, got a master's degree and all the things. But about, oh gosh, 7 or 8 years now, I started to have a bit of a crisis of consciousness where I was doing all this work helping leaders and organizations, and I was starting to question whether or not I was helping them do things that I thought mattered in the world, right? Was I just sort of feeding the corporate machine so that it could keep rolling, or was I actually making any kind of a positive difference? And that kind of helped me take a really important left turn, which was I started to think, like, at this point, I've only got so many more years left to work. As an entrepreneur, I have no idea what that number is, but there's a runway, and I thought, what do I want to do with that time? What would be meaningful to do with that time? What kind of, if I've got like 25 years of leadership development experience, where do I want to apply that where I think it can make the most difference? And so I kind of went back to my feminist roots and started looking at like the numbers, how are we doing on gender equity and women in the workplace and women in leadership, and realized like there's a lot of things that haven't changed that much since I was, 25 or whatever. And that just did not sit okay with me. Like I just was like, if I can do something about this or contribute to doing something about this, I have to. And so that kind of took me down this road into the Women's Leadership Intensive, changing my business at 48 or 49 years old into something new. No, I wouldn't say starting from scratch, but kind of. Yeah, and it's been a really fulfilling, challenging ride since then.
You've accomplished so much, and that sort of mid-career shift, I think, based on your book, which we want to talk about today, has really been grounded in the purpose of making change in our lifetime. It is what we want to see, and I appreciate that so much from you. I have to tell you, this book has been so enjoyable to me. Women, Leadership, and Saving the World. That title is everything, first of all. Everything, and it articulates exactly how I feel about what is needed for the world right now. Why did you decide to write this book, and why now?
Yeah, I mean, I tried not to give it that title in some ways because I thought, oh, that's too bold. But the title's the title. It's the right one. As you said, it's what I think. It's what the research, if all of the research and study that I did, it to develop the Women's Leadership Intensive as an organization, but also then to write this book, it just kept pointing me in that direction, right? This is what we need. We need gender inclusion. That is one of the keys to being able to solve some of the complex challenges we're facing in our organizations, but also in the world, in our society, and this planet. And I think what really triggered me to write the book was I had been doing leadership development by and for women for, a good handful of years at that point in my business, loving it, going very deep, equipping women to get into those roles, to be able to make a difference once they got there, to lead by their values, and to have a really strong leadership skill set so they could be very successful and effective there. And along the way, of course, I would talk about all these things around like, what are the numbers? What is the pay gap? What are some of the real challenges and barriers for women? You know, if we have small numbers of women, why is that? There's a reason, right? There's barriers there. And a lot of the people that I talked to had no idea, right? Not even really realizing, hey, we still have a pay gap in Canada, right? We have pay equity law, but we still have a pay gap. Never mind motherhood penalty and wealth gap and a lot of other things, right? So it was just realizing that I had this information because I did this deep dive and continue to study and read and, you know, all the books behind me. But um, a lot of people just haven't done that work, and rightly so. They don't have the time. It's not their day job, right? And it became my day job. And so that was kind of the impetus to say, I can only work with so many women every year in my programs, right? Because they're hands-on learning and development. How do I reach more people and just get this information into their hands and equip women with some vocabulary to have these conversations? But also, what I was wanting to do with the book was to also let women know, like, I see you, right? If you're having these experiences, it's not just you, it's actually a systemic issue. And we're swimming in that soup together, you know?
I mean, it's not just giving people sort of insights, it's also helping women from the book. Um, I've seen some tools, some advice on how you can move things forward. I want to, we will talk about that a little bit, but I want to talk about like one of the things that stood out to me early on in the book. Um, it really resonated so deeply with me was somebody who, in my career, I help people find work. And I couldn't understand how the work world was set up for 50% of the people to go to work 9 to 5, but their kids are done school at 3 o'clock. Like, what is that? And are there no male responsibility to that piece also? Gosh, can you how has this stayed in place even in the tightest labor markets that we've had?
It's a brilliant question. These are the things that don't make sense to me either. The what I can say about it is that we're, you know, it's time to question all of our assumptions about the way workplaces are structured. And if we're not ready to do that because change is disruptive and it's scary and, you know, it might not go perfectly, then we're just going to kind of perpetuate a lot of these things that aren't really working, as you said, for 50% of the population. And I would question they're not working that well for a lot of men these days either. And so, you know, there was a time, and this is not all of history, by the way. This is just a particular you know, sort of era in history where the workplace, as we know it, you know, in this kind of, you know, post-industrial capitalist kind of way of being, was designed for basically like the traditional nuclear family of the time, which was, of course, like one, you only need one breadwinner in the family, right? Because the economy was very different. You could buy a house on one salary, you could survive on one salary. And the idea that, of course, then it would be the man in the household, you know, and again, it was so heteronormative, which is not the case today. There's so many things about it that just aren't relevant anymore. So the man would go and be the breadwinner, and of course, the woman would stay home and look after the household and the family and do caregiving for the rest of the extended family and community as well. And so it made sense you could build a workplace that was 9 to 5, even though school was, you know, 9:30 to 3, because there was somebody there, right? There were women there who were doing that labor, unaccounted for, unpaid for, etc., unvalued, you know, largely sort of invisible. And so, you know, as those things changed, a couple things, you know, women wanting to go into the workplace, right? Wanting to do something else, like, hey, we, you know, maybe even if we love caregiving roles, we'd like to do other things. I'd like to be an engineer. I'd like to, you know, I'm great with finance or whatever the things are. We wanted to expand into more work. And also, as the economic system starts to shift and there's all this pressure on like, price of housing goes up, price of cost of living goes up, right? Then there's this demand for more double income households have to happen. Now, all of this was based on sort of a storyline of this traditional nuclear family, which really was a pretty white middle class and upper middle class notion at the time because many families and households did not look like that, even in the 1950s, right? And so it's sort of this storyline that became normalized. And I think we're still living in the hangover from that to a certain extent to today, right? The idea that we have these firm boundaries between work life and personal life that, if you're not there from what used to be 9 to 5, I mean, now it's like 8 to 6, right? It's the demands to demonstrate commitment to a job are so high right now that even in families, households where you've got pretty good sort of equal distribution of household labor and caregiving responsibilities, which by the way is still not the norm, but even when you do have that, there's so much pressure to meet all the demands of the workplace, right? It's a system that is, um, I think, kind of either at a breaking point or maybe already past a breaking point. And it's really not just about like plugging our fingers into the cracks. It's about fundamentally reimagining what the workplace should look like. Who does it serve? How does it serve? Um, I think making organizations and corporations be part of communities again. Like this idea, that their function is just to provide shareholder return or profit is an incredibly narrow view. And I think it's inaccurate, right? They have many roles, they have many stakeholders and responsibilities. And so, yeah, I do think, I mean, I I think we need to just rethink and check all of our assumptions that we've been making because, as you said, if we're continuing down this path, it's going to be so hard to attract and retain talent. And I see that a lot of the industries that I work in already know that they're in that talent crisis because they're traditionally male-dominated industries. And so in the past, they've been able to exclude 50% of the population from their talent pool. And now they can't do that. And so they've got a lot of work to do to create more inclusive organizations because even when they can attract women in, they can't keep them, So it's a huge problem. And I'm always surprised when organizations are not paying more attention to this and are not more worried about it, frankly.
Mhm. And you talk about this breaking point, and I think it's a really good way of explaining what's happening, what the sentiments are of the workforce today, raging against this machine for so long hasn't really worked. And you talk about creating change one person at a time. Talk to us about, like, we're at this breaking point, yes, but who's talking about what that change is going to look like, and how are we going to actually evolve this to reflect the modern workforce and modern society? Can you talk to us about maybe a little bit of that, if you know of any of those industries making those changes, but also how one of us could start the momentum to build into something larger?
Yeah. It's always the both and, I think, going back and forth between the individual and the systemic. And, a movement is made up of individuals. And I think we're seeing movements happening in the world right now in terms of, certainly there's re-engagement of movements around women's rights, women's reproductive rights. And I think there's an ebb and flow to this. So I think, there was a huge women's movement that kind of, felt like, oh, well, we've mission accomplished. We're here. So I guess we're done. And then take our foot off the gas a little bit. And now we're seeing some of the consequences of that. And it's like, no, we have to put our foot on the gas again and really sustain. Um, and so I think it's on the individual side, I think it's a couple of things. I think it's really equipping yourself with information because, the media or other sort of sources can basically tell any story using these small sound bites that they want, right? So this story that we've achieved gender equality in the workplace, for example. right? That's a storyline that still gets told. Well, if you look at the data, that's very untrue. And especially, the higher up you go in terms of leadership levels, the fewer women you're going to see. So it's sort of like equip yourself with this information, right? The fact that, we just cracked 10% of women CEOs on the Fortune 500 last year, right? 10%. Or, on the TSX 60, we have one woman CEO right now. Or just look at the political landscape in Canada, right? How many first ministers do we have who are women right now? How many first ministers do we have who are not white? So we have to be looking at this information and sort of trying to bring fact and data into the storyline because it's easy for this to spin. And I think another way that it spins is that someone takes an individual experience that they're having and extrapolates it to be the general norm, right? So, a person works in an industry where they see equal numbers of men and women in leadership in their company, and they look at that and say, well, problem solved because it's solved here. But we have to also be able to like expand that aperture a little bit and see what's happening big picture. So on the individual level, it's informed. And unfortunately, a lot of women in business or women in traditionally male-dominated industries didn't go into those industries because they wanted to be an advocate for this, right? They went in because I want to be an engineer or I want to be a geologist or whatever it is. But when you are in the minority in these spaces, you kind of have a choice to make, which is, am I going to try to increase the size of this space for other people? Or am I just going to, sort of follow my own path and leave that alone? And I think a lot of us realize or have a value system that is about how do I include other people here, not just for myself. And I think that is a very valuable way to move from individual to start to look at collective, right? Even in my team, my company, my industry, and kind of start there. If we look at the systemic side, then I think it's who we vote for. It's what policies we are willing to accept. It's, even when I look at our political options, we've got all this political activity happening in the US right now, which is very interesting and will have a huge impact on us in Canada. It always does. But when I look at the Canadian political landscape about, getting ready for our next election here, I'm pretty disappointed in the slate of candidates that are being put forward. And, why are we not thinking about demanding or requiring a representative slate of candidates from some of these parties, maybe from all of these parties, right? Like, when are we going to look at this picture and say, yeah, I'm justifiably outraged by this lack of diversity? Or I do think younger generations are starting to put some of this pressure on organizations, for example, because they just don't, they're not doing it. They're not working all the extra hours. They're not kind of playing the game that many of us who are older were kind of socialized into playing. I mean, I followed the rules a lot more looking back retroactively. I'm like, yeah, I followed the rules more than I would have wanted to if I was really aware and thinking about it. And so I have a lot of respect for these younger generations who are not following the rules and it's disruptive. And I'm thinking, good, let's disrupt it.
Yeah, it needs to be. It absolutely needs to be. You talk about, women going into these industries because they're interested in that work itself. And you talk a lot in the book about, oftentimes you are the only Black person, the only woman at the table, and being intentional about bringing people along with you. What we've seen in Canadian politics, what we've seen in in workplaces that Black women, for example, get burned out because that's a lot to carry on your own. And when you didn't go in with that intention of having to carry it, it is so burdensome. But these younger generation, it seems, are going in with that intention and saying, yes, I'm going to be the first, but I'm going to be bringing people along with me. And that is hopeful. And that's what it's gonna take to make that change, because, when you get exhausted and burnt out, are you meant to carry all the weight of the world? But collectively, when one person starts, you bring people along, you create a collective, you create a movement, and you can get there.
And this is, you're bringing up a really good point about the burnout, and so, there's been this real uprising in awareness about DEI work, particularly since 2020, with the brutal murder of George Floyd in the US, sort of opened the floodgates for everyone to sort of say, like, oh, we need to be talking about this. We need to be doing something about this. I mean, some progressive companies were already, but there was sort of like this huge sort of uptick. And so a lot of that work started to happen through things like employee resource groups or committees, and it was side of desk work, right? And so who's doing that work, right? Who's on those committees? And you're talking about Black women getting burnt out. It's like, when you think about your DEI committees or ERGs in your workplace, and you look at that picture of who's in the room, it's a very different picture than when you look at a picture of who's on the board or who's on the executive team. And that is part of the problem, right? Because the work of inclusion is the work of everyone. So why are we putting that work on some people's desks and not on other people's desks, right? That should be everybody's job. And so we should be sharing the burden of that work equally. And it is strategic and cultural work, just like any other change initiative that you'd have to make in your organization. It should be paid.
It's really important to have reflection of lived experience, but with that comes that burden. And folks need to take the responsibility to do the learning. And there's lots to learn, and there's lots of ways to learn without having to overburden someone who's already carrying such challenges that they're dealing with on a daily basis.
That's right. Or if you want them to do that work, make it a priority, make it part of their job, make it their whole job, and pay them appropriately to do it. I think is happening is, when there was sort of an explosion of this and everybody started wanting to work on it and talk about it, there wasn't enough sort of structure or roles, or people were just kind of dropped into these positions without appropriate support to be successful in them. And so I think we're maturing. And I think what we're doing is we're getting to a point where we're realizing, like, some of what we've done, hasn't been done that well. And we've realized that, we've learned from it. And now how do we move from here and start to do it better? So it is things like, how do we build inclusive leadership cultures, which includes everybody understanding what inclusive means, right? And everybody having the skills and foundation and vocabulary and ability to do that, because that is where we need to go next, right? It's an all hands on deck change initiative. And so I think we're really, in what I'm seeing and what I'm excited about, is moving into a space of how do we have inclusion now, right? I think there's a recognition, like, surprise, surprise, we do have diversity. Diversity is a fact. And now how do we really set ourselves up for inclusion? And I think that, progressive organizations are thinking about that. They're starting to do work on that. We're certainly getting more requests to do all gender workshops and trainings around inclusive leadership, right? Whereas before it was like, well, could you take the women and, like, fix our problem by giving leadership development to these women? It's like, well, no, because that's not actually your problem. Your problem is your culture. And so the door's opening on this. And I definitely have moments of fear that, we're losing ground. But I'm seeing new doors opening, and that's helping me be more optimistic too.
Yeah, and that's what came across for me, is that bit of optimism. Because when you look at how quickly people acted in 2020, it was sort of a gut reaction and not thought through with process and structure. Having it evolve into deeper thinking, it will go into more sustainable long-term initiatives that are probably much more well embedded in structure or across the organization. So that is optimistic, and glad to hear it. you were getting into something else that I want to take us into. I love how you articulated this unspoken discomfort around the terminology of women's empowerment. It never sat well with me either. And you quoted J.D. Anderson saying, feminism isn't about making women stronger. Women are already strong. It is about changing the way the world perceives strength. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we can change that?
Yeah. I think, it's again this sort of avoidance of having to change the actual system, right? And so we've gone through this cycle of like, well, let's upskill the women. Let's teach them negotiation skills. Let's give them leadership development. Let's do this. Let's do that. And I'm not saying any of those things are not great things. Like develop, develop, develop. I believe in that. But that is, again, it's sort of like it's not solving the systemic problems though. And so lo and behold, it's like, oh, well, women don't ask for, enough salary. That's why we have a pay gap. So we'll teach them to negotiate. They'll negotiate and we'll close the pay gap. Did that. Guess what? Pay gap didn't change. It's sort of like, and so I think it's similar around this term around women's empowerment. It's sort of like, do not talk to me about women's empowerment unless we're going to have a real conversation about power. Who has power? What kind of power, right? Economic power, decision-making power, the power of being in a privileged group in our society, the power of knowing that you are physically safe or financially secure or whatever it might be. Let's talk about power and the way it's distributed in our society, right? Systemically. And then maybe we'll get around to talking about women's empowerment. But if we're starting with this conversation about women's empowerment, it makes me really suspicious because I'm always thinking like, if women are not empowered, why not? What is the actual storyline there, right? And this idea that we're not empowered because we're just not confident or whatever. It's proven to be not true, which makes absolute sense to me. Most of the women that I know have had to be exceptionally competent just to participate in whatever field they're in, right? Like there's very few. Yeah, I think it's like this myth of the diversity hire, right? It's like, oh, well, diversity hire, that means they're not very qualified or competent. It's like that happens so rarely. It's almost not even worth talking about, right? So um, I think this idea of, empowerment, am I all for women being empowered? Absolutely. But why have they not felt powerful so far? And if we're not addressing those things, then empowerment programs are a Band-Aid on a chest wound. It's not going to work.
And it feels as if we'll help women build their confidence, but they're already confident. So when they come into a broken system, they seem aggressive because your system expects them to be timid and quiet and wait in line. And so it has to work together. I thought you made that point really well. That yes, we need to invest in helping anybody develop their skills if they want to grow, but the system needs to be receptive to that, and we're not there yet.
That's right. And we talk about like developing those skill sets. We have to be, again, we have to be developing those in all people, right? And in all leaders in an organization, particularly leaders I talk about because leaders really do set culture. And so that's a great starting point. But the idea that we need to develop women, I mean, the women who come out of our courses and programs, like are excellent in terms of leadership and inclusive leadership and values-based leadership and skill sets to be able to have challenging conversations and all of the different elements of leadership. But they need peers back in their organizations to do that with. And so that's where this sort of, I think, the idea that somehow we don't have to develop men in organizations with that skill set, it doesn't make any sense. It's like everybody that the changes in the workforce and the workplace that you and I have been talking about really necessitate a change in leadership approach. And so we have to upskill all leaders to be able to do a good job in this.
Yeah, and I almost feel that men are set up to fail in this new workforce as leaders because they've been trained in this traditional way. And that is exactly what this workforce is coming against and saying enough is enough. There needs to be shared decision making, shared power. And that's so that dynamic needs to shift, that mindset needs to shift for men. And yeah, then we will be able to collaborate as we move forward on the same understanding. Your
Mhm.
book has been so excellent. It's like I said, dog-eared and well loved. Um, what is your call out to women listening today about leadership and their role in the future of the workforce and the world? What do you want them to know and do?
Well, I mean, good news and bad news, I guess. I mean, that I don't know if this is bad news, but it's not going to change unless we change it. And so many of us are already working very hard in all of our other roles and responsibilities in our lives. And this is another one that I think is going to be driven largely by women, I think, these changes. Um, the good news about that, I think, is that it's really fulfilling and interesting work. And one of the beautiful things about it is that most of us do it in community, right? Like we come together. It's this conversation. It's um, a lot of the networks of women that I would go and talk to or work with. It's communities of women within organizations who are, wanting a place to be able to have these conversations and figure this out. And so I think the richness that's there in terms of um, this fulfilling a value system of wanting to make our workplaces and communities and societies better. And this is certainly a way to do it. And we live in a time when there's a lot of opportunity to get involved. And I guess my sort of call to action is, your leadership might be more important than you think it is. And we have all, as women in this society, been conditioned to undervalue ourselves, our voice, our perspectives, our contributions. And that inner work of seeing that, unwinding it, and coming to a place where we're able to value ourselves is freeing, empowering in the true sense of the word. And I think it is a way to step into our sense of purpose and our values for what we want this world to be like for ourselves, for our collective children, for this planet. I mean, that stuff matters.
It does matter, and I'll share with you something that I sort of fall prey to sometimes. I've been you know, purpose driven and wanting to work with women for so long. And one of the traps that I fall into, because I follow so many women focused organizations and such, that I feel the work is already being done. It's saturated. And if those folks are so much more experienced and knowledgeable, leave it to them. And I think that that's false because I'm just feeding myself with that information, but there's so much work to do that we're all needed, and it does need all hands on deck for us to be able to make change.
Yeah. And it happens everywhere, right? In your household, in your community, in your work teams. Like I think there's a lot of opportunity to start questioning and shifting the dynamic. Um, I know we have lots of conversations in my household about this, right? Where we're unlearning some of that conditioning and gender-based expectations, all of us, right? We're all sort of questioning and unlearning it together. And um, yeah, I don't see that there is any lack of work to do.
Yeah.
And as you said, it does take all of us. I think it will. Because whenever we're making progress, there's inevitable pushback, right? And so we feel that sort of like two steps forward, one step back. I mean, reproductive rights is a great example of that happening. And so um, I was listening to someone speaking the other day. Sorry, what was her book? Oh my gosh. Anyway, I'm going to get it wrong. But anyways, essentially she was talking about the Black women's movement in the United States and saying, what a lot of women's movements, especially white women's movements, have kind of forgotten is that if you win something, you keep going. And if you lose something, you keep going, right? There isn't really a time to take your foot off the gas when it comes to social justice and social change. So yeah, we're all needed in whatever way makes sense for us to show up, and all contributions are part of it, right? It's the collective movement.
I love to have other people experience this that I've experienced from you and on your teachings in this book. Am I wrong that there is a book community that you've formed?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. There's a reflection guide that goes along with the book. So if you want to just read the book and kind of organize your thoughts, right? For the journalers among us, it's a sort of a tool to do that. And then there's also a book club guide or discussion guide. So often what will happen is whether it's a book club or it's a women's network, they'll read the book together and then they'll work through the book club guide. And I also will often, volunteer my time to go and, join the group for half an hour and do a Q&A or so yeah, it's sort of like little pockets of book community. And I love those discussions.
I think I saw in one of your posts how people can get involved in those communities. So I'd love to use that as the resource for this episode where we link, of course, the book, but the link to the book club
Okay,
or how you can join one if that's okay with you.
absolutely.
Wonderful. I mean, you are always sharing such valuable content. I encourage everybody to follow you on LinkedIn. The learning is always great. And I'm sure you'll be willing to speak to people if they're looking for more information.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm very the conversations matter a lot to me. So yeah, I'm always open to people reaching out.
Thank you so much for today, Belinda. We really learned so much. Really appreciate your time today. And we look forward to continuing this conversation because it matters.
Thanks, Eve. It was great talking with you.
All right, everyone, we will wrap it up for today and we will see you in our next episode. Take care.